Good afternoon, gentlemen, as it happens. Thank you all for coming along in this glorious weather. Today, our talk is on the Business Leasing Code for Landlord and Tenants, which Eamon and I co-authored. Eamon and I go back a few years now. He was chair of the Commercial Committee, and then I took over. And our interest in both the Business Leasing Code and green issues has taken us far and wide to various conferences, to London and Toronto, among others. Eamon is a director of Maguire Chartered Surveyors, who are national property consultants. Eamon is a past chair, as I just stated, of the Commercial Agency Committee, and he's also a member of the RSES Commercial Market PG Board in London. And it's my great pleasure to introduce him. Eamon O'Farrell.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, all. You're very welcome. We live in a society where the consumer is at the forefront of our endeavours. The property business is like any other supply business. We have our producers in the form of landlords. We have our route to the market through our agents, and our end consumer is the tenant. If you buy into that principle, you'll buy into this business leasing code. Landlords that adopt this code are saying to the market, we are here to do good business. We intend to act in a professional manner in our dealings with our end consumers. Tenants and their advisors, on the other hand, should set out to distinguish between which landlords abide by this code and those that do not. The objective of this code is to create a framework for negotiations. That framework aims to improve the quality and transparency of negotiations on leasing terms and to promote the drafting of comprehensive heads of terms that should make the subsequent lease drafting process shorter and less contentious. It's worth repeating that last bit, comprehensive heads of terms that should make the subsequent lease drafting process shorter and less contentious. This leasing code and the heads of terms are intended to be used as a checklist for negotiations before the grant of a lease or agreeing on a lease renewal. If there are any departures from the code, landlords should make this clear. Also, these heads of terms are further supported by a leasing guide within the code. So, you're looking at a property, what's on offer? To follow up in that vein, the code advocates front-loading the provision of all necessary data before going to legals, thereby reducing, as we have said, the timing of lease drafting, minimising disputes and the potential subsequent loss of the deal. Parties should agree from the outset on the extent of the property being demised, what is exclusive for the tenant's business use, what is shared in common with others. Site boundaries. Procure a site map early on, preferably stamped by the Land Registry. How is the property to be accessed? Rights of way, easements. How is the property to be accessed? How will you route utilities? Are there any third-party rights that might impact upon your occupation of the premises? Floor plans and method of measurement. Pretty fundamental. How is the property to be measured? With the Code of Measurement Practice, NIA, GIA, GEA. A case in point would be offices in suburban locations have tended to be measured differently to urban areas. Important when comparing like with like. Avoid a phantom space and the impact on fit out. Is the stated floor measurement to be stipulated in the lease? What could be the impact of this approach on apportionment of service, charge, utilities and at subsequent rent reviews? Ancillary space and parking. If you look at the space in the corner there, that was space number 1. I'd asked for a copy of the parking map, and as I always do, needless to say, we didn't take the first space on offer. User restrictions. For example, permitted user. Either the landlord is imposing a restriction or there may be a planning restriction. On several occasions I've had to get landlords to secure planning permission on existing industrial buildings, for example, where the existing permit was for warehouse use only, and we had to get planning to extend for manufacturing. So important to have a look at that. And if you have to go down that route, who pays to correct the planning? You've got to agree that. Other restrictions might be hours of business, hours for access. You often see in terms of, like for example, Rathmines, Ali would generally tend to load very early in the morning because there would be restrictions on access. Time restrictions and goods loading, as I've said. Lease negotiations. Plan on how you're going to approach lease negotiations. You don't always get the deal you deserve, but you do get the one you negotiate. Should the potential tenant make an offer, or does the tenant make a formal leasing proposal? The code recommends, however, that all offers should be in writing. So what should the initial proposal cover? Rent, basis of, we talked about floor area. It could be on turnover, and there could be a blend of that. Lease duration, pretty fundamental. Lease break options, conditions that might be attached to exercising those options. Tenancy renewal rights. Inducements or premium. Repairing obligations, permitted uses we've spoken about, and whether VAT is applicable. Time and time again, this is probably one of the last questions to be asked, and it's pretty fundamental. Financial matters. I'd recommend that tenants put together a schedule like this to look at the real cost of the deal on offer. Rent, how much and often is it reviewed? How is it adjusted? VAT, as we've spoken about. Rates, how are they to be apportioned? Is the property separately rated, or is there an apportionment? Service charge fluctuations. Unusual items of expenditure planned by the management company. You need to know this if you're taking a lease. Building life cycle, and whether there's an adequate sinking fund provision already in place. Building insurance, obviously level of annual premiums. Utilities, are they separately metered? Likely costs, is there existing data from previous occupiers? This will feed into Brian's talk later on green lease clauses. Repairs, depending on obligations, are they IRI, internal repairing, or FRI, full repairing and insuring? Often this will be linked to the duration of the lease that's been opted for. Dilapidations, alterations, tenants fit out, can be very expensive. All that should be fed into your financial review. Rent and security deposits. Strengths of the covenant stroke tenant. Normally the landlord should look for 3 years audited accounts and trade references. What if the strength of the tenant falls short of expectations? One of the remedies would be a security deposit, whether that equates to 1 month or 3 months rent. Who holds that deposit? Again, you've got to agree that. In the case of subsequent insolvency of the landlord, your access to that deposit will be paramount. How long should that deposit be held by the landlord? Mechanism for its early return. This is important again if, depending on the lease duration, if you're taking a 10-year lease plus your company is maybe a startup, and after a couple of years you're performing reasonably well, you might say, look, there should be a mechanism there to get that deposit back. Okay? Interest accruing on that deposit. Okay, that should accrue to the tenant by right. Lease assignment. Is the landlord automatically entitled to a deposit from the new tenant coming in? Remember, this is your money in the case of a tenant. Guarantees. Personal or director guarantees. Again, are these going to be sought? This will normally come up after the initial audit on the company. Parent guarantee. Parent company guarantee. This is coming time and time again where a guarantee has been given by an overseas parent company. Generally what will be looked for here will be a council's opinion in that country to say that the guarantee is enforceable. Invalidation, there's an interesting case, Toplin versus Smith, where the guarantor was not informed of the subtenant doing alterations to the property, even though the landlord was aware of those alterations, and the case found that the guarantor was no longer on the hook. Length of lease term, break clause, renewal rights, implications of the proposed lease, pretty obvious. Duration, 5 years or 10 years. Perhaps you'll want the best of both worlds as a tenant, but the latter will, as I've said, normally attract FRI terms. Early termination options break clause gives you the flexibility as a tenant. However, a future negotiating tool, seek a rent reduction or inducements to stay. So, a break clause does give an advantage to a tenant and allows flexibility. Renewal rights. What are your renewal rights as a tenant? Deed of renunciation. With the abolition of upwards-only rent reviews in new leases, this mechanism is being used more frequently by landlords. And landlords and agents should be clear from the outset of negotiations if a deed of renunciation is going to be required. Might be the cost of other concessions. For example, I was taking a lease for a client, an American client that did not want a 20-year or a 15-year lease. It had to be 10. So what we did was, for a trade with the landlord, is we agreed a renunciation of rights, and the deal went ahead. Lease rent review clauses, a periodic rent review pattern. How is the review to be handled? You're all very familiar with that. Initiation and time restrictions on the rent review. I had a case where a landlord initiated a 2000 review in 2010. So again, look at that and whether the time is of the essence and who can call for the review. Some leases restrict it so that the landlord can only look for third-party arbitration. It should be both. Method to determine the revised rent. Market rent, CPI or turnover. Third-party adjudication, arbitration or independent expert. Both have their advantages. If it's an unusual property, maybe independent expert is the way to go. One thing the code, this code advocates in terms of the revised rent, it would be a standard lease condition that the landlord could charge interest on the backdated increase in the rent. And what we're proposing is where the rent falls and the tenant has overpaid in the intervening period, that they too would be entitled to interest on those monies. Assignment and subletting. Consent not to be unreasonably withheld. There are other issues here. If you hold a lease on multiple floors, particularly in the case of a sublet, are you restricted to one subtenant, or can you lease a number of floors to a number of tenants? Financial standing, implications for the assignee. Rent restrictions in case of a subletting. This was a tricky one in the downturn. I find that landlords may allow you to underlet as long as you waiver the admissibility of the transactional rental evidence as a result. Okay, subletting restrictions on part of the demise. I've spoken that before. Service charges. Establish the services included. Ask to see a schedule from the management company. In the case of offices, is building insurance included? Does the service charge cover air conditioning the suite, running costs and repairs? Legacy issues and sinking fund provision. Does the landlord expect you to contribute to a reserve fund or indeed a sinking fund? Repairs and other major expenditure pending. Following on from my previous comments, can the landlord provide a scheduled maintenance program to back up reserve or sinking fund provision? Get it in writing. Also, I recommend that you get yourself a copy of the SCSI Service Charge Code, which will give you more information on best practice as advocated by the Institute. Repairs. It goes back to what I said about 5-year plus leases and potential tenancy rights being established. The obligations should be appropriate to the lease duration. I have seen leases 5 years where the tenant is responsible for full repairs. Schedule of condition at lease commencement. This is probably, after an agent, the best money that you can spend. Chartered Building Surveyor, they know how to interpret repairing obligations, and they will, a copy of the report will be attached to the lease and should be accepted by both parties. In some cases, the landlord may elect to rectify some of the issues raised. Indemnity against items of concern. Again, on the back of a building survey, the landlord does not want to take corrective action. He might indemnify the tenant, for example, an older roof or windows. Implications for lease assignment and early termination. The landlord may look to address dilapidations before agreeing to an assignment. In the case of a lease break, landlords should look carefully at the dilapidations in such instances, and they could be used, you be wary that they could be used to frustrate the exercise of the break. So is the break conditional on the other aspects of the lease being observed, including dilapidations? Alterations in permitted use. They should be no more restricted than to protect the asset value. Lease conditions regarding structural alterations. Lease conditions regarding structural alterations would generally say have a reinstatement obligation on the tenant. So again, be wary about that. Non-structural alterations generally allowed for in the lease without landlord's consent. Restriction on user in the case of good estate management. Okay, obvious one would be a shopping centre, where other tenants might have a non-compete clause. And implications for the guarantor. Remember what I said earlier in terms of Toplin versus Smith. Building insurance, an obligation to insure. Normally the landlord insures the premises, but is reimbursed the premium by the tenant. Impact on intended user. In the case of multiple occupancy, if your intended use increases the risk, you are normally as a tenant obliged under the lease to carry the premium loading. Competitive cover. Landlords would generally be obliged under the lease conditions to seek competitive cover in the market. Exclusions and inclusions. Check what is covered to make sure the level of cover is adequate for all. Lease termination or rent suspension. On what grounds can leases be terminated or suspended in the case of building damage or dereliction? Emergence of green lease clauses. The Code advocates green lease clauses, and my colleague Brian Meldon, who chairs the Green Lease Clauses working group here, will discuss this aspect in greater detail following my presentation. Ongoing management and applications for consent and tenant defaults. The Code recommends that application for consent are dealt with in a timely manner. Requests for additional information, again, timely, and superior landlord or mortgagor, if that is required, to be noted. In the case of tenant default, early engagement we recommend. Get some professional advice. Statutory obligations. As tenant, you are obliged to rectify some issues in the future to comply with statutory regulations, and that's obviously worth noting. PSRA return, you're probably very familiar with this at this stage. I've been banging on about it for years, but under current legislation, all tenants are legally obliged to file specifics of the lease deal to the PSRA within 30 days of the lease being stamped. The prescribed form, the CL 113, can be filed online. And there are serious financial penalties for non-compliance. Part of this code, we've produced model heads of terms, which can be downloaded from the SCSI website. The heads of terms document is a structured summary of what has been agreed between the parties and is used to instruct the landlord solicitors in drafting the formal lease contracts. Remember, get the heads of terms right and the ground rules are agreed. There will be less arguments and time wasting at the legal contract stage. So in summary, the code is a framework for lease negotiations. The code promotes transparency on the actual demise, costs, rights and obligations, and we've produced a model heads of terms used to instruct solicitors. I now ask my colleague Brian Meldon to run through the green lease aspects of the code.
Thank you very much, Eamon, for an extremely informative and excellent delivery. How many people understand what NZEB means? You can show hands if you like. One person. It never ceases to amaze me. NZEB is near zero energy building, and you will know, it's like at the moment they're saying, oh, we'll all be driving electric cars in 10 years' time. We're now discussing green leases in 10 years' time or less. We won't be discussing green leases, as in Sweden at the moment. A standard lease will have green clauses in it, and that'll be that. The imperative actually is where, green leases have been discussed for 15 years and no longer in various parts of the world. They're more prevalent than others, but as with all the other energy saving initiatives, Ireland are way behind in this one. The reason why it's important to us is because it's going to come in front of you. You are going to be negotiating on behalf of a landlord or a tenant or a rent review, and there will be green clauses in the lease in due course. And the reason is because under the European Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, by December 2018, buildings acquired by public bodies will be acquired under green lease terms, and by by 2022 by everybody else. So there is a legal imperative to have these brought in. But for the commercial benefits, you can see there the asset value is maintained, increased rentals. Enhances the appeal of buildings to high caliber tenants. There's a trend towards green securitization in the form of green mortgages, which are becoming. I was at a lecture on that recently, and again that's going to become. It'll become an initiative because the banks will favour buildings that are obviously a better and a more secure investment long term. And for the tenant, it's designed to a framework to lower the building costs, and you can see the other there. The sharing the investment costs to reach energy efficiency targets. Sustainable workplace increases productivity and satisfaction. If you're spending 90% of your expenditure on your staff and wages, it's important to get a good return. And the greener the building, the argument is the better return from your staff, and encourages a relationship of collaboration to meet corporate and social responsibility. Now, in case you're wondering what this is, I was having a discussion with a colleague who was familiar with the introduction of green leases. He's in one of the larger firms in town, and he said to me, "Oh, by the way," he said, "a green lease came across my desk the other day." I said, "Oh, really?" Well, at that stage, sorry, it was a couple of weeks previous. I said, "Really?" I said, "I'd be really interested to see the clauses in it. You can take out any references to clients, etc." He said, "Okay, I'll send it over this afternoon." He says, "You might be a bit surprised though." So this is what I got. So this was his reaction to the green clauses in the lease. They took them out. So, if you read into it, it's to do with lighting control, smoking areas, sustainability, and the sharing of information. All the things that will, hopefully you'll become familiar with. Now, a possible solution, and to head off this, is to create a building management forum. This is the recommendation anyway. So the landlord will provide a forum to consider the adequacy and improvement of data sharing, etc., etc. the building firm will meet on a regular basis, and they will make recommendations and ensure that the building complies with and maintains whatever certification standard it is, whether it's LEED or BREEAM, to that appropriate standard. Has anyone ever inspected or dealt with a BREEAM or LEED building? So the challenge is to maintain that standard into the future, because ultimately it'll become an obligation under the lease. So our recommendation is, because one of the first things we were advised when Eamon and I were attending a series of green lease lectures, first of all we were told don't call them green leases, so we didn't. For a while we called them building performance leases, but nobody knew what we were talking about, so we went back to green leases, because at the moment that's a term, it's introduction, and people know what we're talking about. We actually have a draft green lease ourselves prepared, and I mean in that we incorporate the green terms into the general clauses in the lease. So you have their standard in black, and then we would introduce, so that the green clauses are scattered throughout the lease and they refer to the actual parts and the obligations specifically. So there's another one. So the tenant should be required to reinstate the tenant's alteration to be carried out during, standard enough terms, but with a green slant on them. So as part of our code, which we are now updating, and the updated code is going to include references and sample terms, is that the heads of terms should clearly state tenants' obligations concerning building energy efficiency, which may incur material costs, place restrictions on tenant fit out, or have implications for the use of the property. Of course, the NZEB certification relies on not only the building during construction, but what you do with the materials that you've taken out and the materials that you're going to be based from time to time, and how you recycle. So that will decide your certification, and your certification at the end of the day, whether it's platinum or gold LEED, will determine the price you get. Because first of all, you will attract as a priority government tenants, because they have to occupy NZEB buildings. And secondly, for example, we gave it earlier there, one of our previous lectures in the Mycene Plaza, the tenant there was one of the tenants was the Department of Health. Yeah. Mind you, they haven't taken up occupation, but that's another day's work. And the other one was, who was the other tenant, Eamon? Shars, yeah. So, and I think the return on that building was massive, between what they bought it for, spent on it, and then sold it, and then valued it at the end. So, this is coming. It's as well that you're informed about it. And if you have any questions, we'd be delighted to take your questions now. And thank you very much for coming. There you go.